The second night at Celestial Bay was bathed in a golden glow, with soft lanterns reflecting off the still ocean. In the distance, the soothing melody of live music from the resort's fine dining restaurant intertwined with the rhythmic whispers of the waves. Yet, amidst this paradise, Alexander Knight felt no serenity. Emerging from the conference room, his mind remained locked in a battle of numbers and strategy. The investment deal, one that had seemed effortlessly within reach, had hit an unforeseen roadblock. The partners had introduced an unexpected clause, one he wasn't ready to accept. Negotiations would resume in the morning, but for now he needed a drink. Or maybe just silence. His assistant had handed him the key to his villa earlier, but due to a system glitch at the resort, the staff had mistakenly given him the key to another villa. Her villa. As he walked along the wooden pathway leading to the overwater suites, he loosened his tie, his fingers brushing against the tension locked in his temples. Numbers, percentages, legal loopholes, all of it spun in his mind. He barely registered the cool night breeze against his skin or the soft glow of the pathway lights. Reaching the villa, he slipped the key into the lock and pushed the door open, stepping inside without hesitation. The room was dimly lit, illuminated only by the warm, ambient glow of bedside lamps. The scent of vanilla and coconut lingered in the air, a fragrance so familiar it sent an unexplainable shiver down his spine. And then he saw her. Isabella. She stood in the living room, wrapped in a simple silk slip dress, her long hair cascading over her shoulders. She was tucking in two small figures, adjusting their blankets with gentle precision. Two boys, identical golden hair, striking green eyes, small but lively features. They looked exactly like him. Alexander froze. The room, the music in the distance, the sound of the ocean, everything ceased to exist in that moment. His breath hitched, his pulse roared in his ears. The resemblance was undeniable. The sharp set of their jawlines, the faint dimple when one of them stirred in his sleep, the way their tiny hands curled over the sheets. Every detail mirrored his own childhood photographs. A wave of nausea swept through him, mixing with a terror he had never known before. His entire life had been built on control. In boardrooms, at negotiation tables, in billion-dollar deals, he had always been in command. He dictated outcomes, calculated risks, ensured that nothing ever slipped beyond his grasp. But this shattered him. His mind spiraled through the past, 7 years of silence. 7 years where he had believed he had left behind a complicated but necessary choice. 7 years of drowning himself in work, believing that success would somehow justify everything. And yet, standing here, watching his children sleep soundly in a life he was never a part of, Alexander realized one devastating truth. He had abandoned more than just a woman. He had abandoned a family he never even knew existed. A quiet gasp pulled him from his daze. Isabella. She had turned around now, her body tense, her hand clenched into a fist as if steadying herself against the weight of what was happening. Her eyes, once filled with warmth, once looking at him with love, were now dark with shock, fury, and something even deeper. Pain. A pain so raw it nearly brought him to his knees. Her lips parted, but no words came out. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them grew suffocating. When she finally found her voice, it was barely more than a whisper, laced with something fragile, something that begged to remain unbroken. "What are you doing here?" Alexander swallowed, but his throat felt dry, as if no amount of air could fill his lungs. He had no answer. Only one thought rang through his mind, deafening in its clarity. Are they mine? It was a ridiculous question, a pointless one. He already knew the answer. It wasn't the kind of truth that required spoken confirmation. It was written in their very existence, in the symmetry of their features, in the undeniable connection that pulled at something deep inside him, and the realization tore through him like a blade. He had been gone for 7 years. 7 years where Isabella had done this alone. 7 years of carrying the weight of his absence. 7 years of tucking in these children at night, answering their questions, filling in the spaces where a father should have been. 7 years of possibly hating him. His silence must have been unbearable because her pain suddenly turned into anger. She stepped forward, her voice trembling with a rage she had likely buried for too long. "Get out." It wasn't a request. It was a demand, a command laced with betrayal. Alexander didn't move. He should have. He should have done as she asked, walked away, given her the space she clearly needed. But he couldn't. His gaze was locked on the sleeping boys, his sons, and he couldn't tear himself away. He wanted to say something. Anything. But what could he possibly say? That he hadn't known? That he had been too focused on himself to wonder about the life he left behind? That he had assumed she would have moved on, built a new life without him? None of it mattered now, because the truth was, he had left, and no excuse would ever be enough. Isabella's voice cut through the silence once more. Sharper, colder. "I said get out. Now." Her hands were shaking, but her resolve was unyielding. Alexander blinked. Slowly, he nodded. But just as he turned to leave, he paused at the door, gripping the handle tightly before glancing back at her one last time. His voice, hoarse with emotions he barely understood, barely knew how to control, came out in a whisper. "Why didn't you tell me?" A bitter laugh escaped Isabella's lips. "Tell you?" Her voice trembled, raw with the weight of 7 years of heartbreak. She shook her head, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "Tell you so you could walk away again? So you could see them as a burden?" Alexander flinched, but she wasn't done. Her next words cut deeper than any deal gone wrong, any financial loss, any betrayal he had ever faced. "You chose to leave, Alexander." She stepped forward, her voice quiet but lethal. "You never came back. So why, after 7 years, do you care now?" A silence heavier than the weight of 1,000 regrets settled between them. For the first time in his life, Alexander Knight had no answer. Because she was right. With nothing left to say, he stepped out into the cold night air, leaving behind a silence that neither of them knew how to fill. A paradise-like beach stretches endlessly, its pristine white sand shimmering under the golden sun. Towering palm trees sway gently with the breeze, their leaves casting playful shadows on the ground. The sky is a brilliant shade of blue, perfectly reflected on the crystal-clear waters that lap at the shore. In the distance, a sleek black helicopter slices through the air, an imposing figure against the serenity of nature. The Bell 429 helicopter descends gracefully onto the private helipad of Celestial Bay, its rotor blades stirring up a soft cloud of fine white sand. As the aircraft settles, the door swings open, revealing Alexander Knight, a man of power, wealth, and unshakable confidence. Dressed in a meticulously tailored charcoal gray suit, the billionaire CEO of Knight & Company steps onto the platform with effortless poise. His polished Italian leather shoes sink slightly into the sand, yet his presence remains unwavering. Every movement is measured, exuding dominance and control. A senior resort staff member approaches, bowing slightly in greeting. "Welcome, Mr. Knight. Your private villa has been prepared, along with the conference room as per your request." Alexander barely nods, his piercing gaze sweeping over the breathtaking landscape before him. Celestial Bay is a masterpiece of luxury. Floating overwater villas stretch elegantly across the lagoon, their sleek wooden designs blending seamlessly with nature. The waves glisten under the sun, reflecting the hues of the sky, but to him, this place is nothing more than another battlefield. A multi-million-dollar deal awaits, and Alexander has no time for leisure. The turquoise waters, the golden sunsets, the romantic air of this place, none of it matters. As he steps into the VIP lounge, he signals to his assistant without breaking stride. "Double-check tomorrow's schedule. I want everything in place, no mistakes." The assistant nods, flipping through his tablet, but Alexander doesn't wait for confirmation. His mind is already elsewhere, calculating risks, anticipating negotiations, preparing to strike. Success is everything, and he is willing to sacrifice anything to achieve it. Meanwhile, on the other side of the resort, a luxury cruise boat glides smoothly toward the dock, its pristine white hull reflecting the golden rays of the afternoon sun. Laughter and chatter fill the deck as guests disembark, some eager for adventure, others simply basking in the opulence of it all. Among them, Isabella Brooks steps onto the pier, her hand firmly holding onto the small palms of her twin sons, Nathan and Leo. "Look over there," she exclaims softly, pointing toward the overwater villas that stretch across the endless turquoise sea. The boys gasp in unison, their emerald green eyes widening with wonder. "Mom, it looks like a castle from a fairy tale," Leo exclaims, bouncing on his feet. Nathan, the more observant of the two, grips his mother's hand tightly. "Is this really where we're staying?" Isabella chuckles, her lips curving into a gentle smile, though a shadow lingers behind her eyes. For 7 years, she had worked tirelessly, sacrificing sleep, pushing through exhaustion, saving every penny she could. Just for this. This wasn't just a vacation. It was a gift. A desperate attempt to give her children a piece of the world they had never known. A world where they weren't just the children of a single mother struggling to make ends meet, but two innocent boys who deserved happiness, adventure, and love. Her fingers tighten around their little hands as she watches other families, wealthy couples strolling along the shore, fathers lifting their giggling children onto their shoulders, mothers capturing moments of joy with their cameras. A pang of sorrow grips her chest. Once upon a time, she had dreamt of a family like that too. But the only man she had ever loved, the man who had given her these two precious boys, vanished from her life without a single explanation. Alexander Knight. The name alone sends a shiver through her spine. 7 years. 7 long years she spent rebuilding her life from the ruins he left behind. Isabella takes a deep breath, pushing the past back into the dark corners of her mind. This time is for her children. She won't let anything, or anyone, ruin it. What she doesn't know is that fate has already set its wheels in motion. A reunion is inevitable. The night wrapped itself around Celestial Bay, the ocean whispering gently against the pristine white sand. The sky stretched dark and infinite, scattered with countless stars reflecting off the tranquil water. Yet, despite the beauty of the paradise surrounding them, two people, separated by nothing more than a few villas, found no solace in sleep. Isabella. A heart that never forgot. Isabella sat on the edge of her bed, her fingers tightening around the silk sheets. Her gaze was unfocused, locked onto the ceiling above as if the answers to her silent torment were written there. She had spent years trying to forget, trying to bury the pain beneath work, responsibilities, and the love she poured into her children. But tonight, the past came rushing back like a relentless tide. New York, 7 years ago. She remembered the first time she met Alexander Knight, charismatic, intelligent, fiercely ambitious. She had fallen for him completely, blindly, in the way that only love in its purest form allows. She remembered the late nights on the balcony, where they would talk for hours, his deep voice wrapping around her like warmth in the cold New York air. He would sip his red wine, eyes locked onto hers, filled with both tenderness and fire. She remembered cooking together, their laughter filling the small kitchen, their hands brushing against each other as they reached for the same ingredient. She remembered the stolen kisses, the whispered promises. And she remembered the night when she asked, "Do you ever think about having a family?" Alexander had chuckled, pulling her close. "I've never thought about it, but if I ever do, it'd only be with you." Those words had melted into her heart, solidified the belief that what they had was real, was unbreakable. But then, he left. "I have to leave for a work assignment. It won't be long." That was the last thing he ever said before disappearing from her life. She had waited. Days, weeks, months. At first she reassured herself. He was busy. He would come back. But then, a month turned into 2. 2 turned into 6. And suddenly she realized he wasn't coming back. The man she had loved so completely had vanished, leaving behind nothing but silence and an aching void where her heart used to be. She had tried to reach him. Calls went unanswered. Messages left unread. Emails ignored. It was as if he had never existed. She had cried herself to sleep more nights than she could count, wondering what she had done wrong. Had she been too much? Not enough? Had he ever truly loved her? And then, 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test changed everything. She had called him, her hands trembling as she dialed the number she had memorized by heart. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." Her stomach twisted. She tried emailing him. No response. She showed up at his old office. He was gone. And for the first time, she understood true abandonment. She had gone to her prenatal appointments alone, sitting in the waiting room as other women held hands with their partners, excitedly discussing baby names. She had filled out medical forms, leaving the father's name section blank because she had no name to write. She had given birth in a hospital room alone, gripping the sheets as she screamed through the pain, without a hand to hold, without anyone whispering, "You'll be okay." There was no father pacing outside the delivery room. There was no one rushing in to hold her or their babies for the first time. It was just her and the 2 little boys who would become her entire world. She had sworn that day she would never need Alexander Knight again. And yet, tonight, he was back, as if 7 years had never passed. Isabella swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the sheets. Her heart ached, not because she still loved him, but because some wounds never truly heal. Across the resort, in a villa not far from hers, Alexander Knight sat on his balcony, a glass of whiskey resting between his fingers. The amber liquid barely burned as he swallowed it down. The pain in his chest was far worse. He had spent years building his empire, making a name for himself, closing billion-dollar deals, ensuring that he would never be powerless, never be vulnerable. He had achieved everything he set out to do. And yet, he had never felt more like a failure. He had once had something worth more than all the wealth and success in the world. Isabella. 7 years ago, when he was given the opportunity to expand his company overseas, he had convinced himself that he was making the right choice. "Just a few months," he had told himself. "Then I'll come back. Then I'll make it right." But months turned into years, and every time he thought about reaching out, something inside him hesitated. Would she even want to hear from him? Would she have already moved on? Would she hate him? So he buried himself in work, drowning out the guilt, convincing himself that if he became successful enough, powerful enough, wealthy enough, he could return without shame. That one day, when he was finally ready, she would still be there. But she wasn't. And now, she never would be, because tonight, for the first time, he had seen the consequences of his absence. Nathan and Leo, his sons. His heart clenched at the thought. He had missed everything. Their first words, their first steps, their birthdays, their scraped knees and bedtime stories. While he had been shaking hands in corporate boardrooms, Isabella had been rocking their babies to sleep at night. While he had been celebrating record-breaking profits, she had been answering their questions about why they didn't have a father. And now, he could never get that time back. The realization hit him harder than any financial loss, any failed deal, any betrayal he had ever faced. For 7 years, he had believed he was in control of his life. But the truth was, he had lost the most important thing before he even realized it. Alexander exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't erase the pain he had caused. But one thing he knew with certainty. He wasn't walking away again. The morning sun rose over Celestial Bay, casting golden rays across the tranquil ocean. The water shimmered like a bed of scattered diamonds, and the luxurious resort remained the picture of serenity. But beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. Rumors spread like wildfire. In the VIP lounge, where the world's elite gathered for their morning espressos and private negotiations, hushed whispers carried an unmistakable air of scandal. "Did you hear? Alexander Knight has twin sons." "Impossible. He's never even been linked to a serious relationship." "Well, I saw a picture. The resemblance is undeniable. This is a massive scandal." Further down the terrace, a group of elegantly dressed women exchanged glances over their mimosas. "And the mother? Who is she?" "Some woman from his past. Apparently she raised the children alone. Can you imagine?" One of them gasped, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "I heard she was trying to keep them hidden, but now the whole world knows." While rumors flooded the resort, the internet was already ablaze. A single photograph, grainy, taken from a distance, was enough to set off a media frenzy. The image, captured the night before, showed Alexander Knight standing outside a private villa. Though shadowed by dim lighting, his expression was unmistakably tense. And inside, partially visible through the doorway, stood Isabella Brooks. The moment the photo hit social media, it exploded. Billionaire Alexander Knight and the secret family he's been hiding? Who is the mystery woman linked to the ruthless CEO? Financial news sites picked up the story. So did entertainment blogs. And soon, Knight & Company's investors were demanding answers. Alexander's inbox was flooded with emails from board members, PR teams, and legal advisors. "Alexander, this is spiraling out of control. We need an official statement. Should we deny the claims? Issue a press release? This could affect your upcoming deals. You need to get ahead of this." But Alexander Knight was not concerned about his reputation. He wasn't worried about his company, his investors, the stock market. The only thing on his mind, the only thing that mattered, was Isabella and his sons. Isabella's desperation. Inside her villa, Isabella Brooks sat frozen, her phone vibrating incessantly on the table beside her. Messages, missed calls, notifications flooding in. She swallowed hard as she scrolled through the headlines. Her worst fear had become a reality. For 7 years, she had shielded her children from the public eye, protecting them from the scrutiny of a world that would only see them as a billionaire's hidden heirs. And now, in mere hours, their names, their faces, their very existence had been dragged into the spotlight. Her hands trembled as she picked up her phone. A message from an old colleague. "Isabella, what's going on?" Is it true? A voicemail from a journalist. Ms. Brooks, we would love an exclusive interview regarding your relationship with Mr. Knight. Our publication is willing to offer... She ended the call before the message could finish. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She needed to leave. She needed to get her children out of here. Rushing into the bedroom, she grabbed a suitcase, throwing clothes inside with frantic urgency. Nathan and Leo sat on the bed, still in their pajamas, watching their mother with confused eyes. Mommy? Leo's voice was small, hesitant. Why are you packing? Are we leaving? Isabella forced a smile, though her heart ached. Yes, baby. We're going home. Nathan frowned. But we just got here. We haven't even gone swimming yet. Isabella closed her eyes, inhaling sharply. She had promised them this trip. A chance to be happy. A break from the routine of school, work, and responsibilities. But none of that mattered anymore. All that mattered was keeping them safe. She zipped up the suitcase, grabbed her purse, and took both their hands. Come on, boys. We have to go. They followed her, their small hands gripping hers tightly as she led them toward the door. But just as she stepped outside, a familiar voice stopped her in her tracks. Isabella, don't do this. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, she turned. Alexander stood at the entrance of the villa. His posture was tense, his jaw clenched. But his eyes, those deep, piercing green eyes, were filled with something that sent a shiver through her spine. Determination. Isabella's grip tightened on the suitcase handle. Her voice was like ice. Move, Alexander. He didn't budge. You can hate me all you want, he said, stepping closer. But you are not taking them away from me. Her chest constricted. Taking them away? She repeated, her voice cracking. You left, Alexander. 7 years ago, you walked away without a single word. You don't get to stand here now and act like I care, he cut in, his voice low. Because I do, Isabella. I care more than you could ever imagine. Her hands shook with anger, with hurt. You don't get to care now, she whispered. It's too late. Alexander's jaw tensed. No, he said, stepping closer. It's not. She shook her head, laughing bitterly. What do you want, Alexander? A chance? A second chance? His expression darkened, but when he spoke, his voice was raw, almost broken. I want the chance to know them. For the first time, something inside her hesitated. For years, she had imagined this moment. If he ever returned, she had sworn she would slam the door in his face, spit venomous words, tell him he was nothing to them. But standing here, looking into his pleading eyes, she realized. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready to let him back in. But she wasn't ready to shut him out either. The silence stretched between them, thick with everything they couldn't say. Finally, Alexander exhaled, his voice softer now. Please, Isabella. She clenched her jaw, her heart warring with itself. Could she really do this? Could she let him stay? Could she let him meet their sons? She didn't know. But one thing was certain. This wasn't over. The silence between them was thick, heavy with 7 years of pain, regret, and unspoken words. Isabella's grip on the suitcase tightened, her heart pounding. She felt trapped, caught between the instinct to run and the unbearable pull of the past. Alexander stood just a few feet away, his gaze locked onto her, not with arrogance, not with the cold calculation of the businessman she once knew, but with something far more dangerous. Sincerity. The same sincerity she had once believed in. The same sincerity that had shattered her when he disappeared. Please. His voice was low, steady, but not commanding. He wasn't here to demand. He was here to beg. Don't take them away from me. Her throat tightened. Nathan and Leo stood between them, their eyes darting back and forth, confusion written all over their innocent faces. She had shielded them from this moment for so long. She had told them that their father was not part of their lives, that it was just the three of them, and that was enough. But was it really enough? She swallowed hard. You don't just get to show up one day and decide you care, Alexander. A muscle in his jaw twitched, but he didn't deny it, didn't try to justify the unjustifiable. I know, he admitted. I know I don't deserve to ask anything from you, or from them, but I swear to you, Isabella, I will not walk away again. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. You say that now, but when things get hard, when you get too busy, too consumed by your work, what then? His eyes darkened. I won't leave. You already did. Her voice was sharp. And you didn't just leave me, Alexander. You left them. Alexander flinched. The blow landed exactly where she had meant for it to. But still, he didn't move. He didn't back down. I lost 7 years, Isabella. His voice was quiet now, almost broken. I can't change that. I can't undo it. But I can be here now. Let me be here now. Her chest ached. She wanted to believe him. But believing in Alexander Knight had once been the greatest mistake of her life. She couldn't make it again. Before she could say another word, Leo suddenly swayed, his small body wobbling unsteadily on his feet. Mommy, I feel dizzy. Panic shot through her like a bullet. Leo. She dropped everything, instantly kneeling before him. His small face was pale, his forehead damp with sweat. And then, his little legs gave out beneath him. Leo! Isabella's scream shattered the morning air. Everything happened in a blur. She reached for him, but Alexander was faster. He lunged forward, catching the boy before he could hit the ground, cradling him against his chest with both arms wrapped around him like a lifeline. Leo? Hey, buddy, can you hear me? His voice was no longer the commanding baritone of a billionaire CEO. It was raw, frantic. Nathan clung to Isabella's side, his little face twisting in fear. Mommy, what's happening to him? Isabella was already pulling out her phone, her hands shaking too much to dial. We need to get him to a doctor, she said, her voice trembling. No. Alexander was already moving. There's a medical center here. I'll get him there. Now. He didn't wait for permission. Didn't hesitate. With Leo limp in his arms, Alexander took off running. And for the first time in 7 years, Isabella had no choice but to chase after him. The medical center was quiet, the sterile scent of antiseptic filling the air. Leo lay on a hospital bed, his tiny body hooked up to an IV, his chest rising and falling steadily now, but still too pale, still too weak. Isabella sat beside him, gripping his small hand tightly. Across the room, Alexander hadn't moved. He stood near the doorway, still in his crisp white dress shirt, now slightly wrinkled from the chaos, but his shoulders were tense, his hands curled into fists at his sides. He looked like a man on the verge of falling apart. The doctor adjusted the IV drip before turning toward them. He was severely dehydrated, probably from too much sun and not enough fluids. His body overheated, which led to a sudden drop in blood pressure. He'll be fine, but he needs to rest and stay hydrated. Isabella let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But Alexander? He was still frozen. His eyes were locked onto the small boy on the bed. His son. A boy he had only met hours ago. And yet, when he thought about the possibility of losing him, it felt like his entire world had crumbled. He's okay, Isabella said softly, watching him. Alexander slowly lifted his gaze to meet hers, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked lost. I almost lost him, he murmured, as if he still couldn't process it. I didn't even know he existed, and I almost lost him." There was something in his voice, something that made Isabella's heart clench. A man like Alexander Knight didn't show vulnerability. But now? Now, he looked utterly broken. She shouldn't care. She shouldn't feel anything for him after everything he had done. But looking at him now, at the man who had just carried their son in his arms like his life depended on it, she felt something she hadn't expected. Doubt. Could she really keep him away? Could she really keep pretending that he didn't belong to them? Hours later, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, Leo finally stirred, his small voice groggy. "Mommy?" Isabella nearly sobbed in relief. She ran her fingers through his soft hair. "I'm here, baby." Leo blinked slowly, then shifted his gaze. His eyes landed on Alexander. There was a long silence. And then, "Mommy? Who is he?" Isabella's breath caught. She knew this moment was coming, and yet she wasn't ready for it. She wasn't ready for Nathan and Leo to look at this man, their father, and see nothing but a stranger. She wasn't ready for the guilt that burned in Alexander's eyes. For the first time, Alexander didn't know what to say, didn't know how to say it, but he refused to walk away. So instead, he did the only thing he could. He knelt down beside the bed, his voice quiet, filled with a pain he had never known before. "I'm someone who should have been here a long time ago." Isabella turned away, swallowing hard. Because for the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted him to leave. The following days at Celestial Bay passed in a haze of whispered rumors, but inside Isabella's villa, an entirely different story was unfolding. Alexander Knight was no longer the cold, untouchable man she once knew. He spent hours with Nathan and Leo, teaching them how to swim, helping them build sand castles, answering their endless questions with patience she never expected from him. And Isabella, despite trying to remain distant, couldn't stop watching him. She saw the way he gently adjusted Leo's sun hat when the sun was too strong, the way he lifted Nathan into the air and spun him around, his deep laugh mixing with the boys' delighted giggles, the way he looked at them, not with hesitation, not with uncertainty, but with something much deeper, with the eyes of a father. That night, as the sky stretched endlessly over the ocean, Isabella sat on the villa's balcony, her arms wrapped around herself as she stared into the horizon. The waves rolled gently onto the shore, mirroring the turmoil inside her. Alexander stepped beside her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice filled with quiet hesitation, he asked, "What are you thinking about?" She exhaled, her fingers tightening against the wooden railing. "Everything." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "The past, you, the kids." Alexander nodded, his hands slipping into his pockets. "I know I hurt you," he said. His voice was steady, but there was something raw underneath it. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, but I need you to know that this time, I'm not walking away." She turned to face him. "You say that like it's so simple." "It's not simple." He shook his head. "But it's the only thing I want to do." A cool breeze rolled in from the ocean, brushing past them. Isabella's heart clenched. She wanted to believe him. But could she? It took only a few days for the rumors to explode. A single photograph, a snapshot of Alexander on the beach, laughing as he played with Nathan and Leo, surfaced online. And with it, a media frenzy. Billionaire Alexander Knight has been hiding his twin sons for 7 years. The mystery woman who stole CEO Knight's heart, who is she? News spread at breakneck speed, splashed across financial headlines, social media feeds, and entertainment gossip sites. By midday, the Knight & Company Board of Directors had sent an urgent email. "Alexander, this scandal is affecting the company's reputation. We need an official statement immediately." For the first time in his life, Alexander didn't care. He didn't care about his reputation, didn't care about the board, didn't care about anything except Isabella and their children. But Isabella? She cared. She had spent 7 years protecting her sons from the public eye, ensuring that they lived a normal life. And now, in just a matter of days, everything was being dragged into the light. "You don't understand," Isabella whispered, pacing the villa's living room, her voice thick with panic. "I don't want them to become part of some media circus." Alexander stood firm, watching her. "Then let me protect you." She let out a bitter laugh. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" The next morning, Alexander Knight called for a press conference. The room was packed. Flashes from cameras lit up the stage. Journalists crowded the floor, murmuring in anticipation. Then, Alexander stepped forward. Tall, composed, unshaken. His deep green eyes scanned the room before he spoke into the microphone. "I know there has been a great deal of speculation about my personal life." His voice was steady, unwavering. "And today I will set the record straight." The reporters held their breath. Alexander exhaled slowly. 7 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life." The murmurs grew louder. "I walked away from a woman who meant everything to me, and in doing so, I lost the chance to know my 2 incredible sons." A ripple of shock ran through the crowd. Alexander's grip on the podium tightened. "I cannot change the past, but what I can do, what I will do, is fight for my family, because nothing matters to me more than them." Silence. For a moment, the entire world seemed to hold still. The ruthless CEO, the untouchable businessman, the billionaire known for closing impossible deals, had just publicly declared his love for a woman and the children he barely knew. The story dominated headlines for weeks. But for Alexander, there was only one thing that truly mattered. Would Isabella believe him? That night, Alexander returned to the villa. Isabella was waiting for him. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, watching him carefully. Her eyes were unreadable. "What did you do?" she finally asked. Alexander shrugged. "I told the truth." She let out a slow breath. "You put your entire company at risk." He stepped closer. "I can rebuild a company, Isabella." His voice was calm, but firm. "But if I lose you and the kids again, I will never get that back." A shiver ran down her spine. She had loved him once, completely. And now, she didn't know how to stop herself from loving him again. Before she could say anything, small footsteps rushed toward them. Nathan and Leo ran straight to Alexander, grabbing onto his legs. "Are you staying?" Nathan asked, his voice hesitant, hopeful. Alexander knelt down, meeting their gaze at eye level. His heart ached. He had lost 7 years, but he wouldn't lose another day. "No," he said softly. The boys' faces fell. "Then," he smiled, "because from now on, I'm never leaving again." Nathan and Leo threw their arms around him. Isabella watched them, her heart twisting in ways she couldn't control. For the first time in 7 years, she allowed herself to imagine a different future. A future where Alexander didn't walk away. A future where they were a family. A real one.